Welcome to New Europe Studios, where you can watch us making the news. Today I'm talking with Barbara James from Henshaw Capital Partners, who is a Pan-African venture capital fund. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, many people will have heard of venture capital, but few will have heard of it in an African context. So this is where we can all learn a little bit more about it. So tell me, I mean, how big is the capital market in Africa for venture funding? How much money are you putting into businesses and entrepreneurs?
Before I answer that, let me just dial back a little bit, because it
sure.
might not be so obvious to people why venture capital might be important in the African context. As you know, we have many challenges in Africa. We have a lot of deficit in many areas. We have huge job issues, we have huge issues with our energy, we have huge issues with climate, etc., etc. And if you take this from an individual's perspective and the perspective of youth, we need to create jobs for our youth in Africa. And those jobs will not be created by governments, because we're looking to reduce the size of governments, and they will be created by the private sector. So many of our solutions in health, in education, in infrastructure, in energy will come from the private sector. And they need financing to start and grow their businesses to address the many issues we have in Africa. So there are different types of financing. We're very familiar with grants. We're also familiar with debt from banks, etc. But private equity and venture capital is an important part of the financing mix for businesses to start and to grow and to create employment. So what we do at Henshaw Capital Partners is to promote venture capital and private equity as a type of financing to help grow businesses and create jobs in Africa. So to come to your question, how much do we have in venture capital in Africa? Let me answer by saying not nearly enough. If you look at the percentage of venture capital and private equity to GDP in Africa compared to Europe or the US or indeed Asia, it's still very, very low. So we do a lot of work trying to work with the different stakeholders in venture capital to develop venture capital in Africa. And those are investors, pension funds, insurance funds, endowments, governments, sovereign wealth funds, to help them understand the venture capital opportunity in Africa and to encourage them to invest in Africa. We work with fund managers. We have very few fund managers in Africa, and we need to increase the number of fund managers in Africa. So we help to launch new funds and new fund managers. We work with entrepreneurs and business owners who need to understand what venture capital is and how they can access it, and we help them do that. And also with policymakers, very important. The policy environment for venture capital decides whether or not it will be successful and profitable for the investors and also for the fund managers.
Okay, because it seems, I mean, Africa may not be particularly well understood in Europe. But one thing I think many people who have visited or lived or have worked in Africa would realise that Africans are, in general, natural entrepreneurs. So the entrepreneurial spirit is extremely strong in the continent. I mean, I've seen a man I knew in West Africa ran a car mechanic business, and he had just one hammer, but he was exceptionally good. So how can we get these funds from these people? You say the government might not be the answer. African governments don't have the greatest reputation. In fact, neither do ours. But what do we need? Is there anything that we can really do in Europe to help with the funding situation for these people?
Yes, there is a lot that we can do in Europe to help with venture capital funding. The European governments and the European Union, for example, through the European Investment Bank, is an avenue for financing private equity and venture capital, so more of that can go on through those institutions. European private institutions, pension funds, and institutional investors can and should be investing in African private equity, not least because it is very profitable and more profitable in a lot of occasions than private equity outside of Africa. You may not know that 10 of the fastest growing economies in the world are from Africa. So a lot is happening in Africa on the business side, and investing in Africa is very profitable for institutional investors. But also for people who are interested in providing grants and technical facilities, impact investors. There's a lot of work to be done around creating an enabling environment for venture capital. And that can be done using grants and using some other technical assistance facilities for people who have that kind of money.
Okay. I mean, if the European Investment Bank is one of the places that you're mentioning as a potential source of funds and advice, how much more do we need from it? I mean, are there any figures of how much is being invested and how much you would like to have available?
I'm sure there are figures. I don't have them at the top of my head. The European Investment Bank produces lots of reports and annual reports, so we can have access to that, I'm sure, online. But to say from the African perspective that it's not nearly enough. And so we need a lot more, and we need to scale up investment in Africa from these different sources, both the European Investment Bank and the other bilateral development agencies, private institutional investors as well.
And of course, I mean, as I mentioned before, one of the problems is that people really aren't that aware of what the situation is in Africa. Some of the growth we've seen in some of these countries is phenomenal.
That's right.
And the potential in the continent is beyond description. There are many problems which have impact upon each other, but there does seem to be a sense that the continent itself has really turned a corner from its own efforts. Is that?
That is correct. The African continent is on the move. I know we've been saying this for a few decades now, but it really is happening. I think Europe can take some of the credit for that. Many of us who studied in Europe and came to European universities are back home in Africa now, helping to create this change and drive this growth in the economy. But you must remember we are starting from very low levels of development. So there's a lot of headroom for us. And we are very determined to move from that developing country status to emerging economies to more developed economies. We're very, very focused on that. And private capital is what will make it happen. So it's a great opportunity for investment, for investors, both private and institutional investors. And we certainly welcome people who want to come to Africa and participate in that growth.
So, I mean, just to put this just in very simple terms that I can understand, never mind anyone else's, the continent has a strong entrepreneurial spirit. The governance and regulatory frameworks are improving. The infrastructure that investors will need is also improving.
That's correct.
So the future does look really quite bright, if only people would grasp the opportunity. Is that the case?
That's absolutely the case, yes.
So if you want to make money, look south of the Mediterranean. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me.